Margaret sat in her old wooden chair, staring at the small Christmas tree in the corner of her living room. The lights twinkled softly, casting a warm glow, but they did nothing to make her feel better. Christmas used to be her favorite time of the year. It was the season of love, laughter, and family. But now it only reminded her of everything she had lost. Her husband, George, had passed away 5 years ago. Her children, busy with their own lives, had moved to different cities. They called sometimes, but their voices felt distant, like echoes from another life. Margaret sighed and pulled a blanket over her legs. The wind howled outside, making the windows shake. The weather report had said a snowstorm was coming. It was going to be a long, cold night. She looked at the clock, 8:15 p.m. Outside, the streets were empty. People were inside their homes, celebrating with their families, eating delicious food, opening presents, and sharing laughter. Margaret wished she could turn back time to when her house was filled with noise, when her grandchildren ran around, and when George sat by the fire, reading his favorite book. But those days were gone. Just as she was about to close her eyes, there was a sudden knock at the door. Margaret jumped. She wasn't expecting anyone. Who could be out in the freezing cold at this hour? For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. But then, knock, knock, knock. There it was again. Margaret hesitated. She wasn't used to visitors anymore. Slowly, she stood up, her joints aching with age, and shuffled toward the door. She unlocked it and pulled it open just a little. The cold wind rushed in, making her shiver. Standing outside was a little girl, no older than 6, wrapped in a thin coat. Her face was red from the cold, her hands trembling. Snowflakes stuck to her long, dark hair. She looked up at Margaret with big, frightened eyes. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. "Can you help my mommy?" Margaret's heart clenched. She opened the door wider and stepped outside, looking past the little girl. That's when she saw her. A woman, young and heavily pregnant, was sitting on the porch steps. She was hunched over, clutching her belly. Her face was pale, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Margaret felt a jolt of fear. The woman was in trouble. Without a second thought, Margaret reached for the little girl's hand and led her inside. Then she rushed to the woman's side. "Are you okay, dear?" she asked, kneeling down beside her. The woman looked up, her eyes filled with pain. "The baby. I think. It's coming." Her voice was weak, shaking with fear. Margaret's mind raced. A pregnant woman, outside in a snowstorm, in labor. This was serious. She needed help. She looked at the girl, who was staring at her with tears in her eyes. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Margaret asked gently. "Lily," the girl whispered. "Okay, Lily," Margaret said, squeezing her hand. "We're going to help your mommy. Don't be scared." She turned back to the woman. "Can you stand? Let's get you inside where it's warm." The woman nodded weakly, and with Margaret's help, she slowly got to her feet. She winced in pain, gripping her stomach. Margaret felt her own heart pounding. She had to stay calm. She led them both inside, shutting the door against the cold. The wind howled outside, but inside, Margaret's quiet home was about to be filled with something else. Fear, urgency, and maybe even a Christmas miracle. Margaret helped the pregnant woman onto the couch, carefully placing a pillow behind her back. The woman groaned softly, gripping her belly as another wave of pain hit her. Margaret's heart pounded. She had never delivered a baby before, but she knew one thing. The woman needed help, and she needed it fast. Lily, the little girl, stood close to her mother, her tiny hands clutching her coat. Her big brown eyes were filled with worry. Margaret gave her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Your mommy is safe here." Margaret quickly grabbed the phone from the table and dialed 911. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the receiver to her ear. After a few rings, a calm voice answered. 911. "What's your emergency?" Margaret took a deep breath. There's a young woman here. She's pregnant and in labor. She needs medical help immediately. The operator asked for her address, and Margaret gave it quickly. But then came the bad news. The snowstorm has blocked most roads, the operator explained. Ambulances are having trouble reaching certain areas. We'll send help, but it may take time. Margaret's heart sank. Time. That was the one thing they didn't have. She looked at the woman on the couch. Her face was pale, her breathing heavy. Another contraction hit, and she let out a soft cry of pain. Margaret knew she had to do something. She couldn't just sit and wait. She turned to Lily. "Sweetheart, what's your mommy's name?" "Her name is Elena," Lily said, her voice barely a whisper. Margaret knelt beside Elena and held her hand. "Elena, I need you to stay strong. The ambulance is on its way, but we might have to deliver the baby here." Elena's eyes widened with fear. I don't know if I can do this." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I was supposed to have the baby in the hospital. Not here. Not like this." Margaret squeezed her hand gently. "You can do this, dear. You are strong. And I'll be right here with you." Elena nodded weakly, her breath shaky. Margaret turned to Lily. "I need you to do something very important, okay? Can you bring me some towels from the bathroom?" Lily wiped her tears and nodded. "Okay." She ran down the hallway, her little feet making soft thuds against the floor. Margaret hurried to the kitchen, filling a bowl with warm water and grabbing some clean cloths. She tried to stay calm, but inside, she was nervous. She had raised children, taken care of her husband when he was sick. But this was something entirely different. She carried everything back to the living room, just as Lily returned with a small stack of towels. "I got them," she said, out of breath. "Good girl," Margaret said, giving her a warm smile. "You're helping your mommy so much." Elena let out another deep groan, her hands gripping the arm of the couch. "It hurts. Oh, it hurts so much." Margaret sat beside her, gently wiping the sweat from her forehead. "I know, dear, but you're doing great. Just keep breathing." Minutes felt like hours. The storm outside howled louder, the wind shaking the windows. The house, once quiet and lonely, was now filled with tension, fear, and hope. Margaret glanced at the clock. It had been nearly half an hour since she called 911. There was still no sign of an ambulance. Elena suddenly gasped, gripping Margaret's arm tightly. I think the baby is coming." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had no choice. She had to deliver this baby. Taking a deep breath, she looked into Elena's eyes and said firmly, "All right, dear. We're going to bring your baby into the world. You're not alone. I'm here with you." Lily held onto Margaret's arm, her eyes filled with trust and fear. Outside, the snowstorm raged on. But inside this small house, something bigger was about to happen. A moment of life, of courage, and maybe even a Christmas miracle. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to steady her shaking hands. She had never delivered a baby before, but there was no turning back now. Elena needed her. The ambulance was nowhere in sight, and outside, the snowstorm only seemed to be getting worse. Elena groaned in pain, gripping the couch tightly. Her face was pale, her forehead damp with sweat. Margaret knelt beside her, holding her hand. "You're doing great, dear. Just keep breathing." Lily stood close, her small hands clutching Margaret's sleeve. Her big eyes were filled with fear. "Is my mommy going to be okay?" she asked softly. Margaret forced a reassuring smile. "Yes, sweetheart. Your mommy is very strong. And soon, you're going to meet your little brother or sister." Elena cried out as another contraction hit. Her body tensed, and she gasped for breath. "It's coming. I can feel it." Margaret's heart pounded. She quickly grabbed the clean towels and warm water she had prepared. "All right, Elena," she said gently but firmly. "I need you to listen to me. When I tell you, I want you to push. Okay?" Elena nodded weakly, her whole body trembling. Margaret turned to Lily. "Sweetheart, can you bring another pillow? Your mommy needs to be as comfortable as possible." Lily ran to the bedroom and returned with a soft pillow, placing it behind Elena's back. "Is this okay, Mommy?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Elena managed a weak smile. "Yes, baby. Thank you." Another contraction hit, and Elena let out a painful cry. Margaret squeezed her hand. "It's time. When you're ready, I want you to push as hard as you can." Elena nodded and took a deep breath. She pushed with all her strength, her face contorted with pain. "That's it, dear. You're doing great," Margaret encouraged. Minutes passed, each one feeling longer than the last. Elena's breathing was heavy, her body exhausted, but she kept going. Margaret stayed by her side, wiping her forehead, holding her hand, and whispering words of comfort. Then, suddenly, a sound filled the room. A tiny, sharp cry. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She looked down and gasped. A baby, a beautiful, tiny baby had just entered the world. Elena sobbed with relief, collapsing back against the pillows. Is the baby okay?" she asked, her voice weak. Margaret quickly wrapped the newborn in a warm towel, her hands trembling. The baby let out another cry, little arms waving in the air. Margaret felt tears sting her own eyes. "Yes, dear, your baby is perfect." She carefully placed the newborn in Elena's arms. The young mother looked down, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, my baby," she whispered, holding the child close. Lily stood on her tiptoes, staring in awe. "Is it a boy or a girl?" Margaret smiled. "It's a boy." Lily gasped in delight. "I have a baby brother." Elena looked up at Margaret, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you." Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek and smiled. "It was my pleasure, dear." Just then, flashing lights appeared outside the window. The ambulance had finally arrived. Relief flooded through Margaret as she opened the door to let the paramedics in. They rushed to Elena's side, checking her and the baby. One of them turned to Margaret with a look of admiration. "You did an incredible job," he said. Margaret shook her head. "She did all the work," she said, smiling at Elena and her newborn son. As they prepared to take Elena to the hospital, Lily turned to Margaret and hugged her tightly. "Thank you for helping my mommy," she whispered. Margaret hugged her back, her heart full. Outside, the snowstorm still raged, but inside, something beautiful had happened. A new life had begun, and Margaret's lonely house no longer felt so empty. The room was filled with warmth and relief as the tiny baby lay safely in Elena's arms. His small fingers curled into fists, and his soft cries filled the once quiet house. Margaret sat beside them, her heart still pounding from what had just happened. She had helped deliver a baby, a Christmas miracle in the middle of a storm. Outside, flashing red and blue lights reflected against the snowy ground. The ambulance had finally arrived, but Margaret knew they weren't out of danger yet. The front door burst open, and two paramedics rushed inside, their boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. One of them, a young man with kind eyes, knelt beside Elena. "Ma'am, we're here to help. How are you feeling?" Elena looked exhausted. She could barely lift her head, but she managed a weak smile. "Tired," she whispered. "But my baby, is he okay?" Margaret handed the newborn to the paramedic. He gently checked the baby, listening to his tiny heartbeat and wrapping him in a thicker blanket. "He's small, but strong," he assured her. "A beautiful baby boy." Elena let out a shaky breath of relief. Margaret could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She had been through so much in just a few hours. The second paramedic, a woman with short brown hair, placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. "We need to get you both to the hospital. The storm is bad, but we'll drive carefully." Margaret's heart clenched. Would the roads be safe enough? Would they make it in time? She looked at Lily, who was standing quietly beside her, her small hands gripping the edge of Margaret's dress. The little girl had been so brave through everything. Now she looked up at Margaret with worried eyes. "Can we go with Mommy?" she asked. The paramedic nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. You'll stay with your mommy and your new baby brother." Margaret felt a sudden sadness. She had only just met Alina and Lily, but in those few hours they had brought life back into her quiet home. Now they would leave, and she would be alone again. She forced a smile and patted Lily's head. "You take good care of your mommy, okay?" Lily's eyes filled with tears. "Will we see you again?" Margaret opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, Alina reached for her hand. "You saved us tonight," she said softly. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Margaret squeezed her hand gently. "You're a strong woman, Alina. You did everything for your baby. I'm just glad I could help." The paramedics carefully lifted Alina onto a stretcher and carried her outside. The cold wind rushed into the house, making Margaret shiver. Snowflakes danced in the air, and the storm howled around them. Margaret followed them to the ambulance, watching as they placed Alina and the baby inside. Lily climbed in beside her mother, wrapping her small arms around her. Just before the doors closed, Lily turned back one last time. "Merry Christmas, Miss Margaret," she whispered. Margaret felt her throat tighten. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." The doors shut, and the ambulance slowly drove away, its tires crunching against the icy road. The flashing lights disappeared into the night, leaving Margaret standing alone in the snow. She took a deep breath, looking up at the dark sky. The stars were hidden behind thick clouds, but the air felt different now, less empty, less cold. As she stepped back inside, she looked around her quiet home. It wasn't just a house anymore. For the first time in years, it had been filled with life, with laughter, with hope. And maybe, just maybe, this Christmas wasn't going to be so lonely after all. Margaret stood at the door for a long time, staring out into the snowy night. The ambulance had disappeared down the road, taking Alina, her baby, and little Lily with it. The howling wind had quieted, and the heavy snowfall now drifted softly to the ground. She sighed and closed the door, locking it behind her. The warmth of the house wrapped around her, but it felt different now, quieter, almost too quiet. Just hours ago, the living room had been filled with urgency, fear, and new life. Now it was empty again. Margaret walked slowly to the couch where Alina had lain, where a tiny baby had taken his first breath. The folded towels were still on the table, the bowl of water untouched. She picked up one of the towels and held it in her hands. It smelled of baby powder and warmth, and for a moment she imagined a tiny heartbeat still lingering in the air. She sat down and looked at the Christmas tree in the corner of the room. Its lights twinkled softly, casting a golden glow across the walls. Before tonight, she had barely looked at it. Christmas had felt meaningless, just another day to get through. But now, something had changed. She thought about Lily's small hand in hers, about the way the little girl had looked up at her with trust and hope. She thought about Alina's tired but grateful eyes and the tiny, beautiful baby who had entered the world right here in her home. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel forgotten. She had mattered tonight. She had saved a life. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat. Who could be visiting so late in the middle of a snowstorm? She stood up and walked cautiously to the door. When she opened it, she was surprised to see her neighbor, Mr. Thompson, standing there with a small box in his hands. "Evening, Margaret," he said with a warm smile. "I saw the ambulance earlier. Is everything all right?" Margaret nodded. "Yes. A young woman and her daughter came to my door. She was in labor, and I had to help deliver the baby." Mr. Thompson's eyes widened in shock. "You delivered a baby? Here? In your house?" Margaret let out a small laugh. "Yes, it was quite the Christmas surprise." "Well, I'll be darned," he said, shaking his head in amazement. Then he held out the box. I baked some cookies earlier. Thought you might like some." Margaret's heart warmed. She hadn't expected company tonight, let alone a kind gesture. "Thank you, John," she said, taking the box. "Would you like to come in for a bit?" He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "That sounds nice." Margaret led him inside, and they sat by the fireplace. She poured them both a cup of tea, and they talked about Christmases past, about family, about the little miracle that had happened in her home just hours ago. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel alone on Christmas Eve. As the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall outside, she realized something. Christmas wasn't just about gifts or big family gatherings. It wasn't about decorations or fancy meals. It was about kindness, about opening your heart when someone needed you the most. And this year, Margaret had received the greatest gift of all: a purpose, a connection, and a little girl's whispered words that still echoed in her heart. "Merry Christmas, Miss Margaret." Margaret woke up on Christmas morning feeling different. For years, she had spent this day alone, with only the sound of the ticking clock and the soft hum of the heater to keep her company. But today, her heart felt warm, filled with the memory of the little girl who had knocked on her door the night before. She stretched and got out of bed, putting on her warm slippers. The house was still and quiet, but it no longer felt empty. She walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. The storm had passed, leaving the world covered in a thick, sparkling blanket of snow. The sky was clear and bright, the sun casting a golden glow over the rooftops. Margaret smiled. It was a beautiful Christmas morning. She walked to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea. As she sipped it, she thought about Alina and her baby. Were they safe? Was Lily excited to meet her baby brother properly? The thought of the little family brought warmth to Margaret's heart. Just then, a knock at the door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Who would visit her on Christmas morning? She set her cup down and hurried to the door, her heart beating a little faster. When she opened it, she gasped. Standing on her porch, bundled up in warm coats and scarves, were Alina, Lily, and a paramedic holding a small bundle in his arms. "Merry Christmas, Miss Margaret," Lily said, her eyes shining with excitement. Margaret covered her mouth in shock. What are you all doing here?" Alina smiled, though she still looked a little tired. "The doctor said I could leave the hospital this morning, since both the baby and I are doing well, and I couldn't think of anywhere else I'd rather go first." The paramedic stepped forward and gently handed the baby to Margaret. "I believe you should be the first to hold him today," he said kindly. Tears filled Margaret's eyes as she carefully took the baby into her arms. He was so small, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, his tiny face peaceful as he slept. A lump formed in her throat. "He's beautiful," she whispered, stroking his soft cheek. Alina stepped closer. "I wanted to thank you properly, Margaret. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened to us last night." Margaret shook her head. "You're the brave one, dear. I just did what I could." Lily tugged at Margaret's sleeve. "We have another surprise for you," she said, bouncing on her toes. Margaret laughed softly. "Another one." Alina reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small red envelope. "This is for you," she said, handing it to Margaret. Margaret hesitated, then carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a beautifully written note. "Dear Miss Margaret, you were there for us when we needed you the most. We don't want you to be alone anymore. Would you like to be part of our family?" Margaret stared at the words, her hands trembling. Her vision blurred with tears as she looked up at Alina, who smiled warmly. "I don't have much, but I want you to be in our lives," Alina said softly. "Lily adores you, and I would love for my son to grow up knowing the woman who helped bring him into the world." Margaret felt something in her heart shift, something she hadn't felt in years. Belonging, love, a family. She looked down at Lily, who was watching her eagerly. Then at the baby in her arms. Then at Alina, who had opened her heart to her. With tears in her eyes, Margaret nodded. "I would love that. Lily squealed with happiness and threw her arms around Margaret. Elena reached out and squeezed her hand. For the first time in a long time, Margaret knew she would never spend another Christmas alone. She had been given the greatest gift of all, a family. The days following Christmas were filled with excitement and joy. Margaret's house, once quiet and lonely, now felt alive with laughter and warmth. Elena, Lily, and the baby, whom they named Noah, spent every day with her, and soon Margaret found herself thinking of them as her family. It wasn't just the holidays anymore. It was a new chapter in her life, one she never expected but now couldn't imagine living without. One cold afternoon, as Margaret prepared tea in the kitchen, she heard the sound of footsteps running down the hallway. It was Lily, her small feet tapping the wooden floor as she rushed in. "Guess what, Miss Margaret?" Lily said, her face lighting up with excitement. Noah smiled at me. "I think he likes me." Margaret smiled as she set down the teapot. "Oh, he definitely likes you, sweetheart. He's a lucky little boy to have you as his big sister." Lily beamed, her eyes sparkling with pride. "I'm going to teach him how to play when he gets older." Margaret chuckled, taking a seat at the table. "That sounds like a great plan. He'll be following you around before you know it." Lily sat next to her, looking thoughtful. "Miss Margaret, can you tell me more about when you were a little girl? I bet you were really fun." Margaret paused, surprised by the question. She hadn't thought about her childhood in years. Her memories were distant, buried under the weight of time and years of solitude. But as she looked at Lily's eager face, something stirred within her. "Well," she began, "when I was your age, I used to love playing outside in the snow. My brother and I would build snow forts, and we'd race each other to see who could get to the big oak tree first." Lily listened intently, her eyes wide. "That sounds like fun. I wish I could have raced with you." Margaret smiled softly. "It was a lot of fun, and I remember the smell of hot cocoa warming up after we come inside. It felt like the best thing in the world." Lily nodded, as if she could imagine it all. "I want to make cocoa like that for Noah when he's older." Margaret felt a wave of warmth wash over her. "That sounds perfect, Lily." The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Margaret stood up and walked to the door, curious about who could be visiting. When she opened it, she was surprised to see her neighbor, Mr. Thompson, holding a large box. "Good afternoon, Margaret," he said, smiling warmly. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I brought over some fresh bread from the bakery and thought you might like some." Margaret stepped aside to let him in. "Thank you so much, John. That's very kind of you." He followed her into the kitchen, where Lily was sitting at the table. "I hope I'm not intruding on the family time," he said, glancing at Lily with a smile. "Oh no," Margaret replied. "You're always welcome here." Mr. Thompson set the box of bread on the counter and sat down at the table. "It's been a while since I've seen you so happy, Margaret," he said gently. "And I can see that little Noah is bringing a lot of joy to your life." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling. "He really has. It's amazing how much a little one can change everything." As they sat together, enjoying the warm bread and tea, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She thought about how different her life had been just a few months ago, and how much it had changed. She had found a family when she least expected it. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Margaret looked out the window at the snow-covered world outside. The light from the kitchen lamp illuminated the room, and the quiet hum of life filled the house. Noah was asleep in his crib, and Lily was busy drawing at the table, humming a song to herself. Elena was in the living room, reading a book with a cup of tea in her hands. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had found something she thought she would never have again: connection, love, and the warmth of a family. She stepped into the living room, where Elena looked up and smiled. "What's on your mind, Margaret?" Margaret sat down beside her. "I was just thinking about how much things have changed, and how thankful I am that you and Lily and Noah are in my life now." Elena reached over and squeezed her hand. "We're thankful for you too, Margaret." You've made this Christmas the best one we've ever had." Margaret smiled, her eyes shining. "I think we all got the best gift this year." And as the night went on, with the warmth of family and love surrounding her, Margaret knew that no matter what the future held, she had finally found a place to belong. The weeks after Christmas passed quickly, and life in Margaret's home was full of energy and joy. The house, once silent and cold, now buzzed with laughter and love. Each day brought new memories. Lily's excited chatter, Noah's tiny giggles, and Alina's grateful smiles. Margaret had never felt more alive. One Saturday morning, as snow gently fell outside, Margaret found herself in the kitchen preparing breakfast. She loved these peaceful mornings. The smell of fresh pancakes filled the air, and Lily's voice floated from the other room as she played with Noah. Alina was at the table, organizing a few papers for work, but her eyes always seemed to drift back to her children. Margaret set the table, feeling content. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home full of love and laughter. "Miss Margaret," Lily's voice rang out. "Can you come here for a second?" Margaret wiped her hands on a towel and walked into the living room. Lily was sitting on the floor next to Noah, who was now sitting up with some support. His big brown eyes sparkled as he reached out to touch his sister's face. "He's getting so big," Margaret said softly, smiling at the baby. "I know. He's going to be crawling soon, I think," Lily said excitedly. "And then he's going to want to play with me every day." Margaret sat down beside them, looking at Noah with a mixture of affection and amazement. He had changed so much in just a few weeks. He was healthy, happy, and growing stronger every day. "I can't believe how much you've all brought into my life," Margaret said, gazing at the two siblings. "You've made everything so much brighter." Lily grinned. "We're a team, right, Miss Margaret?" Margaret chuckled. "We sure are, sweetheart." Just then, Alina entered the room, looking up from the papers she had been working on. "I've been thinking, Margaret," she began, her voice thoughtful. "I know this might sound strange, but I want to make sure we're all settled. You've opened your heart to us, and I want to make sure you're happy too. You've given so much to us, and I want to return that somehow." Margaret looked at Alina, her heart swelling. "Alina, I've never been happier. You don't owe me anything." But Alina shook her head. "I know, but I feel like I should do something for you. You've changed our lives. We've been through a lot, and I want you to feel like you belong here as much as we do." Margaret paused. "I already feel like I belong, Alina. You and the kids have given me something I never thought I'd have again. But maybe we could all do something together." Alina smiled, her eyes lighting up. "What do you have in mind? How about we start some new traditions together?" Margaret suggested. "We could have family game nights, maybe take a trip to the park when the weather's nice, or even bake cookies together on a rainy day." Lily jumped up, her face bright with excitement. "I love those ideas. I'll make a list of all the fun things we can do." Margaret laughed, feeling a sense of joy she hadn't known in years. That afternoon, the family sat around the table, making a list of things they wanted to do together. There was something magical about the way they all shared their ideas and dreams for the future. "We'll start with a family picnic," Alina suggested, smiling at Margaret. "Once the snow melts, we'll have a day in the park." "I want to play soccer," Lily exclaimed. "And we'll bring cookies, and we'll invite our neighbors to join us." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her heart. This wasn't just about them. It was about building a future, creating new memories, and starting over. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret's life became even more fulfilling. She helped Lily with her homework, played with Noah as he began to crawl, and enjoyed quiet evenings with Alina. They talked about everything. About dreams, about the past, about the future. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Margaret looked around at her family. The fire crackled in the fireplace, the soft glow of the lights filled the room, and the house was filled with the sound of contentment. Noah was in Alina's arms, playing with a small toy, while Lily rested her head on Margaret's shoulder. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the peace and happiness that surrounded her. She had come a long way from that lonely Christmas Eve, and now she knew that no matter what the future held, she had found the greatest gift of all: love, family, and a sense of belonging. And in that moment, she felt like the luckiest woman in the world.